The Sound of All Things, written by Maroon Uggleberg and illustrated by Ted Papalis. Like a caterpillar, the roller coaster inched toward the top of the hill. I looked at my father because he was deaf. He spoke with his hands, shaping words into pictures painted on the air. "Tell me what the wheels sound like when we go down the hill," he signed. I didn't have time to answer. Just then, we fell down the shaking mountain. I held my breath and clung hard to the safety bar, imagining that I was riding an angry dragon. Up and down, we bumped and looped. Finally, the dragon slowed to a stop. "What did you hear?" my father signed. "It was loud," I signed back. "Many things are loud. Please tell me better." I pointed at the clouds gathering overhead. "Heavy, like thunder." "Yes," he said. "I can feel that kind of noise." My father and I stepped out of the car. My legs were as limp as 2 wet noodles. Mother was waiting for us. "It was wonderful," my father signed to her. I could hear the wheels turning on the tracks through my hands and feet. "The merry-go-round is more my speed," she signed in reply. My mother was deaf too. Her signs were softer than my father's. Ever since my father had lost his hearing as a young child, he had tried to use his other senses to understand sound. For as long as I could remember, he had been asking me to tell him what things sounded like. Sometimes I wanted to say no. It was hard to think of different ways to describe what I was hearing. As the 3 of us walked toward the boardwalk, a strong breeze shook the leaves on the trees. "I can feel the wind," my father signed, "the way I feel your voice when you talk into the palm of my hand." The wind scattered the clouds, and the summer day grew even hotter. It seemed that all of Brooklyn had come to Coney Island to cool off. We sat on a bench to watch the waves roll in. "Look at how the sunlight is caught in the waves," my mother signed. "Yes," my father answered. "I wonder how they sound." "Why do you always want to know what things sound like?" my mother asked. "You and I will never hear them." "But I will," he signed strongly, "in my mind." My mother's hand sat silently on her lap. "What do you hear?" my father asked me. "What does the ocean sound like?" "It is loud," I answered again. "Don't be lazy," he signed. I squirmed in my seat. I didn't have enough words to tell my father what he wanted to know. The wind had picked up again. A big wave came crashing onto the beach. "What about now?" he asked. "When the ocean is angry, it sounds hard, like a hammer." I banged my fist on the palm of my other hand. He nodded in approval. "Good," he signed. Around us, people swarmed over the boardwalk. They were talking and laughing and eating hot dogs and pink cotton candy. A boy teased a girl by putting taffy in her hair. "Look what he did, Ma," she screamed. "I'll never get it out." "It was an accident," the boy said. I wished for a minute that I was like other kids. He didn't have to explain things to their fathers. Storm clouds rolled back in, mountains of them, hiding the sun. My father jumped to his feet. "Let's go to our favorite Chinese place for dinner," he signed. The waiter greeted us and led us to a table. My father pulled out a notebook and wrote a few words on it. He showed it to the waiter, who then scribbled on his own pad in Chinese. My father pointed at the waiter's bold characters, and then at his own neat letters. Going through their usual routine, they each pretended to be confused. My mother tried to keep a straight face. We both knew that my father and the waiter were old friends who understood each other perfectly. They enjoyed this ordering ceremony as much as the serving and eating part. When we finished our dinner, I asked if we could go to the library. The Coney Island branch was right above the restaurant, and I knew it stayed open late some evenings. As we walked through the door, I breathed in the smell of books and Chinese food. I looked at the hundreds of books crowded on the shelves. They held as many words as there were grains of sand on Coney Island. This was surely the best place to find new words for explaining sounds to my father. "What are you looking for, young man?" the librarian asked me. "My father is deaf," I said. "I want to be able to tell him what waves sound like. Is there a book that can help me?" "Well," she said, "I can see how that would be hard for you. Writers have been trying forever to describe the sounds of the ocean." She thought for a moment. "You know, I think we might have just the book you need. Wait right here." In a few minutes, the librarian returned. "This is one of my favorite poetry books," she said. "Some of the poems are about the ocean." I opened the book. The pictures were beautiful, but some of the words weren't familiar to me. "Would you like me to read one to you?" asked the librarian. I nodded. She sat down beside me and began to read. "Tiny waves cascade against the sand like tinkling bells. Great breakers blot the sun and pound the shore like crashing cymbals. Lost in the sounds of the ocean, I jumped when my father tapped me on the shoulder. He signed that it was time to leave. I'll check this book out to you, and you can take it home," the librarian told me. "Maybe you and your father can read it together, and come back as often as you like. We have lots more words to share." I felt happy inside. When we got back down on the street, the storm had passed, and the sky was covered with a blanket of stars. As we headed home, glittering Roman candles shot up from a barge in the dark ocean. They exploded overhead in a shower of a million wriggling worms of light. My father dragged us towards the boardwalk. The sky lit up with fireworks of dazzling colors and fantastic shapes, turning night into day. Soon the air was full of buzzing, whistling, popping, and screeching. I covered my ears. The lights and colors danced across my father's face. He held out his hands, sniffing the air as if to see and taste and touch and smell the sounds of the fireworks he couldn't hear. After a while, the barge let loose with one last burst. Twisting spiders and spinning wheels, glowing waterfalls, and enormous flowers exploded all around us. Then, just as suddenly as they had begun, the fireworks ended. The stars returned, and the night air was filled with the smell of burning wooden matches. Confetti ashes fell softly, like snow. It was time to go home. After a short subway ride, we climbed the stairs to the street. When we stepped onto the sidewalk, I heard the squeal of an incoming train, and I felt the rumble under my feet. I knew my parents could feel that rumbling too, but not hear the sound. As we walked home, I tried to imagine what it was like to be deaf. If I closed my eyes, I could imagine being blind, but there was no way I could ever know what it was like being deaf. Back home in our apartment, I could hear our neighbor through the open window. Somewhere, a radio was playing, people were laughing and talking, a dog barked. I knew my mother and father were sitting in their silent world, as they did every evening. I sat on my windowsill, listening to sounds that my parents would never hear. When the sun rose the next morning, I knew my father would ask me to describe them. I slowly turned the pages of my new book. I couldn't wait to tell him about the sound of all things.